The morning Eliza Vance disappeared, Caleb Thornridge didn't notice right away. That should have told him something about the kind of man he'd become. But Caleb Thornridge hadn't spent much time thinking about what kind of man he was in well over a decade. Men like him didn't need to. They just were. Like mountains, like storms, like the hard-packed Texas earth that either broke you or made you iron. He came down the stairs at precisely 6:30, same as every morning for the past 16 years. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked its familiar rhythm. His boots hit the oak floors with the same measured cadence they always did. Outside, the August heat was already building, turning the air thick and close. But inside the Thornridge mansion, everything stayed cool, controlled, perfect. Everything except the silence. Caleb paused at the bottom of the stairs, one hand still on the banister. Something felt off. Wrong in a way he couldn't name. The coffee wasn't brewing. It was a small thing. Stupid, even. But Eliza had been brewing his coffee at 6:15 every single morning for 12 years, ever since she'd started as his housekeeper. The smell of it usually hit him halfway down the stairs, dark and bitter, the way he liked it. This morning, nothing. He walked through the hallway into the kitchen, his footsteps echoing louder than they should. The room was spotless, same as always. Counters gleaming, everything in its place. But the stove sat cold, and the coffee pot was exactly where it had been the night before, washed and put away. "Eliza?" His voice bounced off the walls, unanswered. Caleb frowned. In 12 years, she'd never once been late, never called in sick, never missed a day. She lived in the small house out back, used to be the foreman's quarters before Caleb had consolidated his operations. And she was always up before him, always had the house running smooth as clockwork before he descended for breakfast. He walked to the back door, opened it, looked across the yard toward her cottage. The windows were dark. The little porch sat empty, the rocking chair she sometimes used in the evenings perfectly still. Something cold touched the base of his spine. Caleb Thornridge was not a man who felt unease. He'd built his fortune by looking at problems straight on and crushing them into submission. He'd survived droughts that killed off his competitors. He'd weathered economic crashes that sent other ranchers crawling to the banks. He'd walked into rooms full of men who hated him and walked out with their land deeds in his pocket. But standing there in his kitchen, looking at that empty cottage, he felt something he hadn't felt in 20 years. Fear. Not of Eliza. That would have been ridiculous. She was 50-something, rail-thin, spoke maybe 10 words a day if you were lucky. She kept his house, collected her wages, and stayed out of his way. Perfect arrangement. No, what scared him was simpler than that. The routine had broken. And Caleb Thornridge lived and died by routine. He crossed the yard in long strides, his earlier measured pace abandoned. The grass was dry, crunching under his boots. He took the 3 steps up to her porch in one go and knocked on the door. "Eliza, you in there?" Nothing. He knocked again, harder. "Liza!" The door swung inward, unlocked. Hell, it hadn't even been latched. Caleb stepped inside and immediately knew she was gone. Not just out, gone. The air had that empty quality to it, that particular stillness that comes when a place stops being inhabited and starts being just a place. The cottage was sparse. Eliza had never been one for decoration. A single bed, neatly made. A small table with one chair. A lamp. A wardrobe that stood open, empty hangers swaying slightly in the breeze from the door. Her clothes were gone. Her shoes. The little wooden box she kept on the nightstand, gone. On the table sat a single piece of paper folded once. Caleb picked it up with fingers that didn't quite feel like his own. He unfolded it. The handwriting was neat, precise, the letters carefully formed. "Mr. Thornridge, I won't be returning. My wages are settled through the end of the month, so we're square. Don't try to find me. What you've been looking for all these years isn't lost anymore. It's where it belongs. E.V." He read it 3 times, then a 4th. The words didn't change. What you've been looking for. His hand went to his vest pocket. The movement was automatic, unconscious. He'd done it 10,000 times over the years, just a quick touch to make sure it was still there. His fingers found only fabric. The locket was gone. For a moment, Caleb couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The world seemed to tilt sideways, and he had to grab the edge of the table to steady himself. She'd taken it. That goddamn woman had gone into his bedroom, into his private space, and stolen the one thing in this world that mattered. No, not mattered. That was the wrong word. The locket didn't matter. It was just a piece of silver, tarnished and old. It had been in his vest pocket for so long he barely remembered it was there most days. Except he checked for it every morning, and every night, and sometimes in between when he thought no one was looking. The rage came then, hot and clean and familiar. This was better. Rage he understood. Rage he could use. Caleb crumpled the note in his fist and stalked out of the cottage. He crossed back to the main house, taking the stairs to his bedroom 2 at a time. His room was exactly as he'd left it. Bed made with hospital corners, clothes hung precisely in the wardrobe, papers stacked on the desk in neat piles. He went straight to the vest he'd worn yesterday, the one he'd hung on the chair before changing for dinner. His fingers dove into the pocket. Empty. He checked the other pocket. Then the vest he'd worn the day before that, and the one before that. He tore through his wardrobe, checking every piece of clothing, every pocket, even though he knew it was pointless. He knew exactly which vest he'd had it in. Had it in yesterday morning, had checked it before breakfast like always. She must have taken it yesterday evening, after he'd changed for dinner. While he'd been in his study going over the books, she'd come up here and Caleb forced himself to stop, to breathe, to think. 12 years. The woman had worked for him for 12 years, and in all that time he'd never once seen her go anywhere near his personal effects. She cleaned around them, sure, but she never touched his desk, never moved his papers, never so much as straightened a pen that he'd left askew. But she'd been watching. All this time she'd been watching him check that pocket, watching him touch that locket through the fabric, watching him guard it like a man guards a wound he doesn't want anyone to see. And then she'd waited until the exact right moment to take it and run. Don't try to find me. Caleb laughed, a harsh sound that had no humor in it. He walked to his window and looked out over his land, 5,000 acres of the finest grazing territory in Texas, stretching out to the horizon. Cattle dotting the landscape like dark seeds, fences running straight and true, marking boundaries that other men had learned not to cross. He'd built this. All of it. Started with 200 acres his father left him and turned it into an empire that made senators nervous and bankers smile. He'd done it by being smarter, harder, and more ruthless than anyone else. And she thought he wouldn't find her? She thought she could just walk away from Caleb Thornridge with the one thing with his property, with his stolen property. That's what the locket was. Property. Something that belonged to him, that she had no right to take. He turned from the window and headed back downstairs, his mind already working through the logistics. He'd need supplies for the road, need to figure out which direction she'd gone, how much of a head start she had. The study door was open. That stopped him cold. He always kept it locked. Always. There were things in there that no one got to see. Contracts, land deeds, financial records that would make his competitors weep with envy and his few remaining critics weep with rage. He pushed the door open wider. Everything looked normal at first glance. Then he saw his desk. The ledger was open. The big one. The one he kept in the locked drawer. The one that tracked every land acquisition he'd made in the past 20 years. Someone had gone through it, turned pages, left it open to a specific entry. Caleb walked over slowly. He didn't want to look. Didn't want to see which entry she'd left it open to, because he already knew, somewhere deep in his gut he already knew, June 14th, 1855. The Vance property. 40 acres, prime creekside land. Acquired through foreclosure after the owner defaulted on a loan. One adult male deceased, farming accident. One adult female, name of Sarah Vance, relocated to parts unknown. No heirs, no contest to the claim. He stared at the entry, at his own handwriting, neat and precise, recording the transaction like it was any other business deal. And it had been, hadn't it? Just business. The man had needed money, Caleb had provided a loan with the land as collateral, and when the man couldn't pay, when the man had the bad fortune to get crushed by his own plow in the spring of '55, well, that was just how things went sometimes. Foreclosure, acquisition, just words in a ledger. Except he remembered Sarah Vance's face when he'd come to take possession of the land. Remembered her standing on that porch with her brother's body not yet cold in the ground, her eyes red from crying, her hands shaking as she'd held out the deed. "Please," she'd said, This is all we have. This is all that's left of him. And he'd taken it anyway. Of course he had. It was legal. It was his right. The brother had signed the papers, had understood the terms. You don't make exceptions in business, not if you want to survive. Sarah Vance had left town 2 days later. He'd heard she'd gone east, maybe St. Louis, maybe further. He'd heard other things too over the years, whispers about what happened to young women alone with no money and no family. But he'd never confirmed any of it, never followed up. It wasn't his concern. Vance. E.V. Eliza Vance. The cold feeling was back, spreading through his chest like frost. He turned from the desk and walked back to the kitchen, moving on autopilot now. He needed to think, needed to piece this together. Eliza had come to work for him 16 years ago. No, wait, 12 years ago. Summer of 1861, she'd shown up at his door asking about the housekeeper position he'd advertised. She'd been quiet, competent. Her references had checked out. He'd hired her on the spot. 16 years after he'd foreclosed on the Vance property. After he'd taken the land from Sarah Vance and sent her out into the world with nothing. His hand went to his vest pocket again, found nothing. What you've been looking for all these years isn't lost anymore. He hadn't been looking for anything. He'd just been living his life, building his empire, doing what needed to be done. Except for the locket. Except for checking that pocket every morning and every night, making sure it was still there, making sure what? Caleb forced himself to remember, to go back to that place he'd locked away. The locket had belonged to, no. He wasn't doing this. He wasn't dredging up the past just because some vengeful housekeeper had decided to play games. The locket was his property. That was all that mattered. She'd stolen it, and he was going to get it back. He went to his study, pulled out a map of Texas and the surrounding territories, and spread it on the desk next to the open ledger. If Eliza had left early this morning, and she must have, to be gone before he woke, she'd have maybe a 6-hour head start, assuming she left around midnight. On foot, that put her maybe 20 miles away, probably less. A woman her age couldn't move fast. But she wouldn't be on foot. She'd have planned this. She'd have arranged transportation. The stagecoach didn't run until tomorrow. The train station was 40 miles south. Unless she had a horse, which he doubted she could afford, she'd have had to, the Hendricks place. Old Tom Hendricks ran a sort of informal taxi service, taking people to the train station or the next town over in his wagon for a few dollars. He lived about 3 miles east. Caleb grabbed his coat and headed for the door. Then stopped. Thought about it. Went upstairs and packed a bag, clothes for a week, his revolver, ammunition, money. If this was going to take more than a day, he wanted to be prepared. 20 minutes later, he was on his horse heading east, the morning sun climbing behind him. The heat was already building, but he barely felt it. His mind was running through scenarios, possibilities, working the problem like he'd work any business deal. Find out where she'd gone. Follow her trail. Catch up to her. Take back what was his. Simple. Tom Hendricks was in his yard when Caleb rode up, working on a wagon wheel. He looked up, squinting against the sun, and his face went carefully neutral when he recognized his visitor. Mr. Thornridge. Tom. Caleb dismounted, keeping his voice level. I'm looking for my housekeeper, woman named Eliza Vance, 50 or so, thin, brown hair going gray. You take her anywhere in the last day or so? Tom's hands kept working on the wheel, but something shifted in his eyes. Might have. That's not an answer. Well, it's the answer you're getting. Tom straightened up, wiping his hands on his pants. A lady wants to travel somewhere. That's her business. I don't discuss my passengers with people who come asking questions. Caleb felt his jaw tighten. She stole something from me. Did she now? It wasn't a question. Tom's voice stayed flat, unimpressed. You report it to Sheriff Dawson? This is between me and her. Uh-huh. Tom went back to his wheel. Then I can't help you. Caleb pulled out his wallet, thumbed through bills. $200. Just tell me where you took her. Tom didn't even look at the money. Can't help you. $500. Mr. Thornridge. Tom set down his tools and turned to face him square. I don't care if you offer me your whole damn ranch. That woman paid me fair and square for a ride, and she did it polite and proper. Whatever business you have with her, it ain't mine. Now, I got work to do. Caleb stared at him. In 20 years of dealing with people in this territory, he couldn't remember the last time someone had refused him. Not refused a business deal, not refused a negotiation, just flat out refused, period. "You know who I am," Caleb said quietly. "I do. You know what I can do to people who cross me." Tom met his eyes, and there was something there. Not quite fear, not quite defiance. Something sadder, more resigned. "Yeah, I know that too. Seen you do it plenty, but some things matter more than money, Mr. Thornridge. Maybe you'll figure that out someday." He turned back to his wagon wheel, and the conversation was clearly over. Caleb stood there for a long moment, anger and disbelief warring in his chest. Then he got back on his horse and rode away. He tried 3 more people that morning. A shopkeeper in town who he knew Eliza had done business with. The postmaster. Even young Billy Wade, who ran errands for half the families in the county and saw everything that happened. Same result every time. Either they hadn't seen her, or they had and weren't telling. The ones who weren't telling all had the same look in their eyes. That sad, knowing look. Like they were watching him fail at something and taking grim satisfaction in it. By noon, Caleb was back at his ranch, his horse lathered and irritable, his mood black. She'd planned this. Carefully. She'd made sure people would protect her, cover for her. How many of them had she talked to? How many people in this county had she been quietly organizing against him? He stabled his horse and went back to the house. The silence hit him again, heavier now. No coffee, no lunch prepared. No Eliza moving through the rooms with that quiet efficiency, keeping everything running smooth. Caleb walked through his empty house and felt something crack inside him. Something small but crucial, like the first fissure in a dam. He'd spent 20 years building this place, this empire. He'd thought he was building security, building power, building something that would last. But standing in his kitchen with the afternoon sun slanting through the windows, he realized he'd built a tomb. A beautiful, perfect, expensive tomb, and he was the only thing in it. The locket. He needed to focus on the locket. Caleb went back to his study, sat down at his desk, closed the ledger with Sarah Vance's name in it. He pulled out fresh paper and started making a list. Places Eliza might go, people she might contact, ways to track her down. But his mind kept drifting, kept going back to that vest pocket, to the weight of the silver locket that had sat there for, how long, 20 years? More? And what was in it? He tried to remember. There'd been something inside, hadn't there? A photograph, a lock of hair, something. He couldn't remember. That scared him more than anything else that had happened today. He'd carried that locket for 2 decades, checked on it thousands of times, guarded it like his life depended on it. And he couldn't remember what was inside it. What you've been looking for all these years isn't lost anymore. He crumpled the paper he'd been writing on and threw it across the room. This was stupid. He was sitting here obsessing like a crazy person over a piece of jewelry, over a woman who meant nothing to him beyond her ability to keep house, over the past, which couldn't be changed and didn't matter anyway. He stood up, paced to the window, looked out over his land again. 5,000 acres. Livestock worth a fortune. Buildings, equipment, contracts with the railroad. Real things. Solid things. Things that mattered. The locket didn't matter. The past didn't matter. But even as he thought it, his hand went to his vest pocket again. Empty. A knock at the door startled him. Caleb turned, irritated. He wasn't expecting anyone. He walked to the front entrance and opened it to find Sheriff Marcus Dawson standing on his porch, hat in hand. "Caleb?" "Marcus, what brings you out here?" The sheriff shifted his weight, uncomfortable. "Had an interesting morning. 3 different people came by, all wanting to know if they could get some kind of protection order, I guess you'd call it, against you." Caleb blinked. "What?" "Said they were worried you might come around asking questions, maybe get aggressive about it. Wanted to make sure they had legal backing if you showed up at their property." "Who?" "Tom Hendricks, for one, Mary Sawyer at the general store, and old Billy Wade." Dawson put his hat back on. "Now, I told them I wasn't issuing any orders without cause, but Caleb, what the hell did you do?" "My housekeeper stole from me. I was trying to find out where she went." "And how exactly did you try to find out?" "I asked people, that's all. I asked questions." Dawson studied him for a long moment. "Tom said you threatened him." "I did not." Caleb stopped, replayed the conversation in his head. I pointed out that people who cross me tend to regret it. That's not a threat. That's a fact. Jesus Christ, Caleb. Dawson shook his head. Listen to yourself. You sound like a thug. I sound like a businessman protecting his property. Yeah, well, right now you sound like a man who's about to do something stupid, so I'm here to make sure you don't. Dawson leaned against the porch railing. What'd she take? Caleb hesitated. Saying it out loud felt wrong, like admitting to something shameful. A locket, silver, nothing valuable. Then why do you care? It's mine. Uh-huh. Dawson's eyes were sharp, seeing more than Caleb wanted to show. And that's the only reason? Caleb didn't answer. Look, Dawson said after a moment, I don't know what's going on between you and this woman. Don't particularly want to know. But I'm going to give you some advice, and you're going to listen because we've known each other too long for bullshit. He straightened up, squared his shoulders. Whatever you're thinking of doing, riding after her, tracking her down, confronting her, don't. Just let it go. It's a locket. It's not worth whatever price you're about to pay. You don't understand. I understand perfectly. Dawson's voice went hard. I understand you've spent 20 years turning yourself into the kind of man people file protection orders against. I understand you've built an empire on other people's backs and convinced yourself it makes you strong. And I understand that right now, you're about to throw all of it away chasing after something that probably should have stayed lost. He stepped off the porch, heading back to his horse. Go after her if you want. It's your life to ruin, but don't say nobody warned you. Caleb watched him ride away, anger burning in his chest. Who the hell did Dawson think he was, coming here and... It probably should have stayed lost. The words echoed in his head as he closed the door and walked back inside. His house was still silent, still empty, still perfect. Caleb sat down at his desk and pulled out the map again. He stared at it for a long time, tracing routes with his finger. East, west, north, south. Texas was big, but it wasn't infinite. There were only so many places a woman could disappear to, and Caleb Thornridge had never failed to find something once he set his mind to it. He would find Eliza Vance, he would get his locket back, and then what? The question hung in the air, unanswered. Outside, the sun climbed higher, and the heat pressed down like a weight. In the distance, his cattle moved across his land, following the same paths they always did, eating and sleeping and living lives that were simple and comprehensible. Caleb envied them. He looked down at the open ledger on his desk, at Sarah Vance's name written in his own careful hand. At the date, June 14th, 1855, 22 years ago. What you've been looking for all these years isn't lost anymore. It's where it belongs. Where did it belong? He didn't know. But somewhere deep inside, in a place he'd walled off and buried and tried to forget, he was terrified of the answer. 3 days later, Caleb was 60 miles east of his ranch, sitting in a saloon that smelled like stale beer and broken promises, listening to a man lie to his face. I told you, mister, I haven't seen any woman matching that description. The bartender wiped down the counter for the third time, his eyes fixed on the wood like it held the secrets of the universe. Caleb took a slow sip of whiskey. It burned going down, cheap and harsh. That's interesting because the clerk at the boarding house 2 blocks over said she stayed here 3 nights ago. Said she came in for dinner, sat right at that table by the window. The bartender's hand stopped moving. Clerk's mistaken. He described her perfectly, right down to the gray streak in her hair. Lots of women got gray hair. Caleb set his glass down carefully. He was tired, bone tired. His back ached from sleeping on the ground, his head pounded from too much sun and not enough water, and he was running out of patience. Listen, he said, keeping his voice level. I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want to know which direction she went when she left. Can't help you. Can't or won't. The bartender finally looked up and Caleb saw it again, that same expression he'd been seeing for 3 days. Not fear, not hostility. Something worse. Pity. Won't, the bartender said flatly. Now, you can finish your drink and move on, or you can leave now. Your choice. Caleb stared at him. The saloon had gone quiet. The 3 other patrons, 2 cowboys playing cards in the corner and an old man dozing at the bar, were all watching now, waiting to see what he'd do. He could push it, could threaten, could bring his weight down like he'd done 1,000 times before. Instead, he drained his glass, dropped a coin on the counter, and walked out. The afternoon sun hit him like a fist. He squinted against it, fishing his hat from his saddlebag and jamming it on his head. His horse, a big gray gelding named Smoke, stood hitched to the rail, half asleep in the heat. "At least you're honest," Caleb muttered, untying the reins. "Don't pretend to be something you're not." The horse flicked an ear, but otherwise didn't respond. Caleb mounted up and sat there for a moment, looking down the dusty main street of whatever town this was. He'd stopped keeping track. They all looked the same after a while. A handful of buildings clustered around a crossroads, people scraping by, everyone knowing everyone else's business, and everyone apparently knowing his. He'd tracked Eliza this far through sheer stubbornness and a few lucky breaks. The stagecoach driver in Brennan's Creek had been new, hadn't known who Caleb was, and had cheerfully confirmed that yes, a woman matching that description had bought passage east. The telegraph operator in Millerville had been drunk and talkative. A farmer outside Grayson had seen her walking along the road and given her a ride into town. But here, the trail had gone cold. No one would talk to him. Or rather, they'd talk. But they wouldn't say anything useful. Just variations on "can't help you" delivered with that same pitying look, like he was the one who'd done something wrong. Caleb turned Smoke east and nudged him into a walk. There was another town about 20 miles ahead, according to the map. Maybe he'd have better luck there. The landscape rolled by, endless and indifferent, prairie grass gone brown in the heat, occasional stands of scrub oak, a hawk circling overhead, looking for something small and unlucky. His mind wandered as he rode, slipping back to things he didn't want to think about. The locket had contained a photograph. He remembered that now. A tintype, small enough to fit in the palm of his hand. A woman's face, young and serious, staring at the camera like she was trying to memorize it. What else? There'd been something else. Hair, yes, a lock of dark hair tied with a piece of ribbon. And on the back of the photograph, writing. He couldn't remember what it said. Couldn't remember the exact words. Couldn't remember whose face was in that photograph. That was a lie. He knew whose face it was. Had known all along. He just didn't want to say her name, not even in his own head. The sun crept across the sky. Smoke plodded along, occasionally snorting at grasshoppers that jumped across the trail. Caleb's canteen was getting low. He'd need to find water soon. Around 4 o'clock, he spotted a farmhouse in the distance, smoke rising from the chimney. He changed direction, heading toward it. Even if they wouldn't talk about Eliza, they might at least spare some water. The place was small, well kept. A garden plot out front, a chicken coop, a barn that had seen better days but was still standing. A woman was hanging laundry on a line, her back to him as he approached. "Afternoon," Caleb called out when he was close enough. The woman turned, and her face went through a series of expressions in rapid succession. Surprise, recognition, anger, and finally a kind of cold neutrality. Mr. Thornridge. He didn't recognize her. "Ma'am, I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm running low on water. Would you mind if I filled my canteen from your well?" She stood very still, a wet sheet in her hands. "That depends." "On what?" "On whether you're going to threaten me when I tell you I haven't seen the woman you're looking for." Caleb felt something twist in his gut. "How did you—" "Word travels." She went back to hanging the sheet. "Especially about Caleb Thornridge riding around the territory harassing people." "I haven't harassed anyone." She laughed, a short, bitter sound. "You're right. Harassment would require you to see us as people worth harassing. Mostly, you just run over us. Like we're not even there." "I don't know what you're talking about." "No." She pinned the last corner of the sheet and turned to face him fully. "I don't suppose you do. Why would you remember Margaret Sutton? You only took everything she had." The name rang a bell, faint and distant. "I don't— 16 years ago, my mother borrowed money from you to save our farm after my father died. The interest rates were— well, they were what they were. We couldn't keep up. You foreclosed. Took the land, the house, everything." She picked up her laundry basket. "We survived. Barely. But we survived." Caleb sat there on his horse, trying to find words. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Sutton, but business is—" "Business. Right." She started walking toward the house. "The well's around back. Take what you need and go." He dismounted and led Smoke to the back of the house. The well was there, old but functional. He drew up a bucket and drank first, the water cold and sweet. Then he filled his canteen, drank again, filled it again. When he turned to leave, Mrs. Sutton was standing on her back porch, watching him. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Caleb tensed. "What? Why? Why are you doing this? Chasing this woman across half of Texas over a piece of jewelry? It doesn't make sense." "It's not about the jewelry." "Then what's it about?" He opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. "It's mine. She had no right to take it. And you had the right to take our farm, our home, everything my mother worked for?" "That was different. That was business, legal business." Mrs. Sutton shook her head slowly. "You really believe that, don't you? You really think there's a difference?" "There is a difference." "Maybe," she crossed her arms. "Or maybe you've just been telling yourself that for so long you can't see what you've become." Caleb climbed back on his horse. "Thank you for the water. Mr. Thornridge?" She waited until he looked at her. "She's leading you somewhere. You know that, right? This isn't random. She's not just running. She's taking you exactly where she wants you to go." "Why would she do that?" "I don't know. But if I were you, I'd think real hard about what's waiting at the end of this trail before I got there." He rode away without responding, her words chasing him like ghosts. The next town was called Redemption. The irony wasn't lost on him. It was bigger than the last few, a proper town square, actual shops instead of just a general store, even a small hotel. Caleb checked in, paid for a room, and spent an hour washing the trail dust off in a basin of lukewarm water. He looked at himself in the cracked mirror above the dresser. He looked older than he remembered. When had that happened? The gray at his temples had spread, lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. Or maybe they had, and he just hadn't noticed. He touched his vest pocket again. Still empty. Downstairs in the hotel dining room, he ordered dinner and ate mechanically, not tasting it. The other diners kept glancing at him, then looking away quickly when he met their eyes. Word had spread here too, apparently. After dinner, he went to the saloon. Not to drink, he needed to keep his head clear, but because saloons were where information lived. This one was nicer than most. Clean sawdust on the floor, a piano in the corner being played by a woman in a green dress, actual glasses instead of tin cups. Caleb found a spot at the bar and ordered coffee. The bartender was young, maybe 25, with the kind of open face that suggested he hadn't learned to be careful yet. "Passing through?" he asked, setting down the coffee. "Maybe. Looking for someone." "Who?" "Woman about 50, traveling alone. Would have come through here maybe 3-4 days ago." The bartender's expression shifted. Not closed exactly. More careful. "A lot of people come through here. This one would stand out. Older woman, no luggage to speak of, paying cash." "Why are you looking for her?" "She has something that belongs to me." The bartender wiped down the counter, thinking, "What's she to you?" "She worked for me. Left without notice." "Uh-huh." The young man poured himself a glass of water, took a sip. "You know what's funny? Woman matching that description did come through here a few days ago, like you said. Stayed one night at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house." Caleb leaned forward. "Which direction did she go?" "Here's the thing." The bartender set down his glass. "She sat right where you're sitting now. Had coffee, same as you. And you know what she did? She left a message. Said if anyone came asking about her, specifically if Caleb Thornridge came asking, I should tell him something." Caleb's heart was hammering. "What message?" "She said, tell him he's asking the wrong questions." The bartender met his eyes. "What does that mean?" "I don't know." "Well, she seemed to think you would." He picked up a glass and started polishing it. "She also left this." He reached under the counter and pulled out a small envelope, yellowed and sealed. Caleb's name was written on it in that same neat, precise handwriting from the note back at the ranch. Caleb took it with hands that weren't quite steady. "She just left this here, knowing I'd come. She said you would. Said you were predictable that way." The bartender went back to polishing glasses. "Paid me $10 to hold on to it. I think she would have paid more, but that's what I asked for." Caleb stared at the envelope. It was thin, didn't seem to contain much. He could open it right here, right now. Instead, he stood up, dropped a coin on the counter for the coffee, and walked out. Back in his hotel room, he sat on the edge of the bed and held the envelope up to the lamplight. Couldn't see through it, couldn't tell what was inside. He's asking the wrong questions. What did that mean? He was asking where she went. What questions was he supposed to ask? Caleb broke the seal and pulled out a single piece of paper. The handwriting was different this time, shakier, older. Not Eliza's. Caleb, if you're reading this, it means you came after her. I wondered if you would. I wondered if, after all these years, you'd finally care enough about something to chase it. You don't remember me. Why would you? I was just another name in your ledger, another piece of land to acquire, another obstacle to remove. But I remember you. I remember the day you came to our farm. I remember how you looked at my brother's body lying under that plow like it was an inconvenience. I remember you explaining the terms of the foreclosure while I was still trying to understand that he was gone. You took our land, our home, everything we had, and you did it with papers and lawyers and perfect legal procedure, so you never had to see what it cost. You want to know where those papers led me? You want to know what happens to a young woman alone with no money and no family in 1855? I'll tell you, but not here. Not in a letter you can read and then burn and forget about. If you want your locket back, if you want to understand what you've been carrying all these years, you'll have to come to the place where this started. She knows where. She'll take you there. But Caleb, and listen carefully, when you see what's waiting for you, you won't be able to unsee it. You won't be able to go back to your ranch and your ledgers and your comfortable story about how everything you did was just business. So maybe ask yourself, do you really want your locket back, or do you just want to stay who you are? The choice is yours. It always was. SV. Caleb read the letter 3 times, then a 4th. The handwriting wavered in places, like the person writing had been shaking or crying. SV Sarah Vance. This wasn't from Eliza. This was from her sister. Written when? Recently? Years ago? When you see what's waiting for you, you won't be able to unsee it. He stood up, paced to the window. Outside, redemption was settling in for the night, lamps being lit in windows. People heading home from the saloon. Normal life, continuing on like always. She knows where. She'll take you there. Eliza was still leading him, still several steps ahead, planning this out like a chess game. But why? What was the point? If Sarah wanted to confront him about what happened 22 years ago, why not just do it? Why this elaborate trail? You won't be able to go back. Caleb pressed his forehead against the window glass, cool against his skin. He could stop. Could turn around right now, ride back to his ranch, hire a new housekeeper. Forget any of this ever happened. The locket was just a thing, an object. He could live without it, except he'd been carrying it for 20 years. Checking for it every morning and every night, guarding it like his life depended on it. Why? He pulled the letter out again, stared at Sarah Vance's shaky signature. He'd taken her land, foreclosed on her brother's debt, sent her out into the world alone. And then what? What had happened to her? He tried to remember if he'd ever wondered, ever followed up, ever cared about what became of the people whose lives he'd legally, properly, perfectly destroyed. The answer sat in his chest like a stone. No. He'd never cared. They were just names in a ledger, transactions, numbers, not people, not real. Caleb folded the letter and put it in his vest pocket. His hand brushed empty fabric where the locket should be, and the absence of it felt like a wound. Do you really want your locket back, or do you just want to stay who you are? He didn't sleep that night, just sat by the window and watched the town go dark, building by building, lamp by lamp, until there was nothing left but stars and silence. At dawn, he was back on the trail. The bartender had told him, after some persuasion and another $10, that Eliza had asked about the road to Millerville. Specifically asked about the old stage route, he'd said, the one they stopped using 5 years ago when they built the new road. Longer route, rougher terrain, but it goes through some of the original settlements. Why would she take that route? The bartender had just shrugged. Maybe she likes scenery. Maybe she's not in a hurry. Or maybe, he'd paused, maybe she wants to make sure you see something along the way. Now, riding that old stage route, Caleb was starting to understand what that meant. The first stop was a town that wasn't there anymore, or rather it was there, but only as bones. Empty buildings with windows like dead eyes. A church with no roof. A schoolhouse slowly collapsing in on itself. A sign, faded but still readable. Harmony. Established 1849. Caleb had heard of Harmony, knew it had been a thriving settlement once, died out when the railroad chose a different route. He'd never been here himself. But as he rode down what used to be the main street, something nagged at him, something familiar. He stopped smoke in front of the old general store. The door hung crooked on one hinge. Through the broken windows, he could see empty shelves, dust thick as carpet. There was a piece of paper tacked to the door. Recent. The paper was still white, not weathered. Caleb dismounted and pulled it down. Look familiar? This was the Johnson settlement. 37 families. You held the note on the community well. When they couldn't pay, you claimed water rights, forced them to either buy water from you at triple the rate or leave. They left. This is what leaving looked like. He stared at the paper. Johnson Settlement. The name was in his ledger somewhere. He was sure of it. But he'd never thought about what happened after. Never considered that taking water rights could kill an entire town. It was just business. Caleb crumpled the paper and dropped it, climbed back on his horse, rode away from the ghost town without looking back. But 5 miles later, there was another one. Smaller this time, just a cluster of abandoned houses around a dried-up creek bed. Another note, this one wedged into a fence post. The Hernandez Farm. You foreclosed in 1859. 3 generations lived here. Where do you think they went? And 10 miles after that, another. The Blackwell Ranch. You undercut their prices until they couldn't compete, then bought their land for pennies. The father hung himself in the barn. Did you know that? Did you ever wonder? By the time the sun was setting, Caleb had found 7 notes, 7 places, 7 reminders of things he'd done and never thought about again. He made camp that night by a creek, built a small fire, and sat staring into the flames. The notes were spread out on the ground in front of him, held down by rocks against the evening breeze. 7 families. 7 lives ruined. And those were just the ones Eliza had bothered to mark. How many others were there? How many names in his ledger represented not just transactions, but people, families, lives torn apart? He'd never counted, never wanted to know. You won't be able to unsee it. Sarah Vance's words echoed in his head. She was right. He couldn't unsee this now, couldn't ride past these ghost towns and empty farms and pretend they were just places. They were evidence. Proof of what his empire was built on. Not hard work, not smart business, not even ruthlessness. Wreckage. His empire was built on wreckage. Caleb fed the notes into the fire one by one and watched them burn. But burning them didn't make them less true. He thought about turning back, just mounting up and riding west back to his ranch, back to his life. He could still do that, could still choose to not know, to not see, to not care. But his hand went to his vest pocket again, found that empty space where the locket should be. Why did he care so much about that locket? What was in it that made it worth this? He fell asleep without an answer and dreamed of Sarah Vance's face. Except in the dream, he could see it clearly. Young, serious, staring at him with eyes that asked a question he didn't know how to answer. In the morning, he found another note tucked into his saddlebag. He hadn't heard anyone approach during the night, but there it was, folded neatly and placed where he'd be sure to find it. You're almost there. 1 more day east, then north to the old Vance homestead. You remember where that is, don't you? I'll be waiting. E.V. Caleb read the note twice, then tucked it in his pocket with the letter from Sarah. The Vance homestead. Of course. That's where this had been leading all along, back to where it started. Back to the place where he'd taken everything from a woman who'd only asked him for mercy. He saddled Smoke, kicked dirt over the fire, and started riding. The sun climbed behind him, harsh and unforgiving. The land stretched out ahead, familiar and strange at the same time. And somewhere out there, Eliza Vance was waiting. Waiting with answers he wasn't sure he wanted. Waiting with a past he'd spent 20 years trying to bury. Waiting with a locket that contained what? A photograph. A lock of hair. A name. A promise he'd broken. A woman he'd... No. He wasn't going there. Not yet. Not until he had to. Caleb rode on, and with every mile, the weight in his chest grew heavier. Not the weight of the missing locket, The weight of everything he'd refused to carry, everything he'd spent a lifetime pretending didn't matter, everything that was about to matter more than he could possibly imagine. The Vance homestead sat exactly where Caleb remembered it, though memory had softened the edges in ways reality refused to match. He crested the hill just after noon on the 6th day, and there it was, 40 acres of creekside land that should have been prime grazing territory, but instead looked like abandonment had taken root and grown wild. The house still stood, barely, its clapboard siding gray and warped. The barn had collapsed on one side, its roof caved in like a broken promise. Fence posts leaned at drunken angles, their wire long since rusted through or stolen. And under the old oak tree by the creek, a woman sat waiting. Not Eliza. Even from this distance, Caleb could tell. This woman was younger, though not young, maybe 40. She sat on a wooden chair that looked like it had been carried out there specifically for this purpose, her posture straight, her hands folded in her lap. Caleb's throat went dry. He nudged Smoke forward, down the hill, across the overgrown field that had once produced corn and wheat. The horse picked his way carefully through the tall grass, disturbing grasshoppers that flew up in clouds around them. As they got closer, the woman didn't move, didn't stand, just watched him approach with eyes that were dark and steady and completely unreadable. 20 feet away, Caleb stopped, dismounted. His legs were stiff from days in the saddle, and for a moment he just stood there, holding Smoke's reins, trying to find words. The woman spoke first. "You're late. I expected you yesterday." Her voice was low, controlled, an educated voice. Not what he'd expected from a housekeeper who'd spent 12 years cleaning his floors. "Eliza," he said. "Miss Vance, if you don't mind." She gestured to a spot on the ground in front of her. "You can stand if you prefer, but we're going to be here a while. You might as well be comfortable." Caleb tied Smoke to a fence post and walked over. He didn't sit. "Where's my locket?" "Right to business. That's very you." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "It's here, safe, exactly where it's been for 6 days. Give it to me." "No." The word hung in the air between them, flat and final. Caleb felt anger surge up, hot and familiar. "You stole from me. That's theft. I could have you arrested." "You could try." Eliza's expression didn't change. "But we both know you won't. Because if you involve the law, you'll have to explain what's in this locket, and I don't think you want to do that." "You don't know what's in it." "Don't I?" She unwrapped the cloth slowly, revealing the silver locket. It caught the sunlight, gleaming. "Shall I describe it for you?" A tintype photograph of a woman. 23 years old when it was taken. Dark hair, serious eyes. On the back, an inscription, "To CT, who promised me the world. All my love, SV." She looked up at him, and a lock of her hair tied with a blue ribbon. Caleb's hands clenched into fists. "You had no right." "I had every right." Eliza's voice went hard. "That's my sister in that locket. My sister, who you made promises to. My sister who believed you when you said you'd be different from all the other ruthless men trying to carve empires out of this territory." The world seemed to tilt. Caleb reached out, grabbed the oak tree for support. "Sarah was your sister. Half-sister technically. Same mother, different fathers, but yes." Eliza stood up now, still holding the locket. "She was 19 when you met her. You were 24, fresh back from school in the East, full of ideas about building something better, building it right." I don't remember." "Liar." The word cracked like a whip. "You remember. You've been carrying her picture for 22 years. You check for it every morning and every night. You remember." And he did. The memories were flooding back now, breaking through the walls he'd built, drowning him in details he'd spent decades trying to forget. Sarah Vance standing by this very creek, her skirt wet from wading in the shallows, laughing at something he'd said. Sarah in the barn, helping him look at a horse he was thinking of buying, pointing out a problem with its gait that he'd missed. Sarah at a dance in town, her hand in his, moving through the steps like they'd been doing it their whole lives. Sarah saying yes when he'd asked her to marry him. Sarah believing him when he'd promised he'd build something good, something that helped people instead of crushing them. "We were engaged," Caleb said. His voice sounded hollow, distant. "For 6 months. 8 months. Eliza sat back down. "And then her brother died." crushed by his plow in the spring of 1855. Freak accident. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong everything. Caleb closed his eyes. He could see it. Thomas Vance's body under that plow. The blood. The impossible angle of his neck. Could hear Sarah's screaming when they'd found him. He'd borrowed money from you 3 months earlier, Eliza continued, to buy seed to repair the barn, $500. You'd given him good terms because of Sarah, because you were going to be family. The terms were fair. The terms were generous. Until Thomas died. Until you realized that Sarah couldn't possibly pay back the loan on her own. Until you saw an opportunity. That's not how it happened. Then tell me how it happened. Eliza leaned forward. Tell me why the man who was engaged to my sister foreclosed on her brother's debt before the body was even buried. Tell me why you took this land, the land you knew she loved, the land where you'd proposed to her under this very tree, and put it in your name. Tell me why you broke your engagement and sent her away with nothing. Caleb opened his mouth. Closed it. Tried to find the story he'd been telling himself for 22 years, the version where he'd had no choice, where it was just business, where he'd done what any reasonable man would do. But standing here, under this oak tree, with Sarah's sister staring at him with eyes that demanded truth, he couldn't find that story anymore. There was a drought coming, he finally said. I could see the signs. And I knew that if I didn't expand my holdings, consolidate my water access, I wouldn't survive. Neither would anyone who depended on me. So you took her land. I took the land I had legal claim to. You took her home, Caleb. Eliza's voice went quiet, which somehow made it worse. You took the place where she grew up, where her parents were buried, where her brother died. You took the one thing she had left in this world, and you justified it with contracts and drought predictions and survival. I offered her money, enough to start over somewhere else. You offered her $300 for property worth 10 times that. You offered her charity in exchange for everything. It was more than I had to give. It was less than she deserved. Eliza stood again, walked to the creek, stood looking down at the water. Do you know what happened to her after you sent her away? Caleb didn't answer. Didn't want to know. Wanted to stop this conversation, mount his horse, ride back to his ranch and his ledgers and his comfortable lies. She went to St. Louis first, Eliza said. Tried to find work as a seamstress, but there were 100 other girls trying to do the same thing. Girls with families, with connections, with letters of reference that didn't come from a town in the middle of nowhere, Texas. She picked up a stone, tossed it into the water. She lasted 3 months before her money ran out. Then she tried Kansas City, then Chicago. And with each city, she got a little more desperate, a little more willing to compromise. Stop. Why? Because it makes you uncomfortable? Because you don't want to hear what your just business actually meant for the woman you claim to love? I did love her. The words came out raw, torn from somewhere deep. I did. Then why? Eliza turned to face him, and there were tears on her face now. Why did you choose land over her? Why did you break your promises? Why did you become exactly what you swore you'd never be? Because I was scared! The words exploded out of him, louder than he'd intended. Because the drought was coming, and I could see what was going to happen, and I knew that if I didn't take that land, someone else would. Someone who wouldn't even offer her $300. Someone who'd leave her with nothing. So you left her with nothing and told yourself it was mercy. I left her with money, with options, with trauma. Eliza walked back toward him, each step deliberate. With the knowledge that the man she loved valued 40 acres more than her heart. With the understanding that promises mean nothing when there's profit to be made. Caleb sank down to sit at the base of the oak tree. His legs wouldn't hold him anymore. Where is she? Where's Sarah? Eliza pointed. See that rise about 100 yards south? He looked. There was a small hill covered in wildflowers that had gone brown in the late summer heat. There's a grave there, Eliza said. Simple marker, just her name and dates. I put it there myself 7 years ago, when I finally had enough money saved to bring her home. The world went very quiet. Even the creek seemed to stop making sound. She's dead. She died in Chicago in 1866. Cholera. She was working in a factory by then, making uniforms for the army. The conditions were, well, they were what they were. When the outbreak came, she didn't have the money for a doctor. didn't have family nearby, didn't have anyone who cared whether she lived or died. Eliza sat down across from him, the locket still in her hands. She was 34 years old. And you want to know the worst part? The part that made me spend 12 years working in your house, watching you, waiting for the right moment to do this? Caleb couldn't speak, could barely breathe. She never stopped loving you. Right up until the end, she kept that picture of you, kept telling herself that you'd had good reasons, that you'd been forced to make hard choices, that somewhere inside you were still the man who'd promised her the world under this tree. She opened the locket, looked at the photograph inside. She sent me letters over the years. Not many. She was ashamed of where she'd ended up, what she'd become. But in every single one, she asked about you. Asked if you were well. Asked if you'd married. Asked if you'd built the good thing you'd promised to build. And what did you tell her? I told her the truth. That you'd built an empire. That you were rich and powerful and feared. That you'd crushed every competitor, bought up every piece of land you could get your hands on, and turned yourself into exactly the kind of man you'd sworn you'd never be. Eliza's voice broke. And you know what she said? Caleb shook his head. She said that maybe you'd had to do it. Maybe the world had forced you to become hard. Maybe there was still good in you somewhere, buried under all that armor. Eliza wiped her eyes. Even dying in a tenement in Chicago, she made excuses for you. Even then. I didn't know. I didn't know what happened to her. You didn't want to know. There's a difference. Eliza closed the locket. After she died, I spent 3 years trying to figure out what to do with my anger. I thought about coming to your ranch and shooting you. Thought about burning your house down. Thought about 100 different kinds of revenge. Why didn't you? Because Sarah wouldn't have wanted that. For all your betrayals, she never wanted you to suffer. She just wanted you to see, to understand what your choices had cost. Eliza stood up, walked over to him, and held out the locket. So I got myself hired as your housekeeper. I watched you for 12 years. Watched you check for this locket every single day. Watched you guard it like it was the most precious thing you owned. And I realized something. Caleb took the locket with shaking hands. It felt heavier than it should, like it was made of lead instead of silver. You already knew, Eliza said. Some part of you, buried deep, already knew what you'd done, already knew what you'd lost. That's why you kept her picture. That's why you couldn't let it go, couldn't move on, couldn't build anything real with anyone else. She gestured around at the abandoned homestead. This is your empire, Caleb. This is what you actually built. Ghost towns and empty houses and graves of people who believed in you. And somewhere under all that wealth and power, you knew it. You've known it all along. Caleb opened the locket. Sarah's face looked back at him, young and serious and full of hope. He traced the outline of her face with his thumb, remembering how she'd smiled, how she'd laughed, how she'd looked at him like he was capable of being better than he was. I can't change what happened, he said quietly. I can't bring her back. No, you can't. Eliza sat down again, suddenly looking exhausted. But you can stop. You can look at what you've become and decide whether this is who you want to be for the rest of your life. And if I decide I don't, if I want to change, what then? Then you figure out how to live with what you've done. You figure out how to make the rest of your life mean something other than accumulated wreckage. She pulled out another envelope from her pocket. Sarah left you something, a letter. She wrote it a month before she died. Caleb took it, not sure he could handle reading anything else. Did you read it? Yes. She gave me permission. Eliza stood, brushed off her skirt. I'm going to walk down to the creek for a while. Give you some privacy. When you're done, we can talk about what comes next. She walked away, leaving him alone under the oak tree with a locket and a letter from a dead woman who'd loved him when he was still capable of being loved. Caleb sat there for a long time, just holding the envelope. He could burn it, could ride away, could refuse to read whatever final message Sarah had left him. But he'd already come this far, already seen the ghost towns and empty farms, already heard the truth about what his empire was built on. He opened the envelope. The handwriting was shaky, worse than in the letter Eliza had left at the saloon. Sarah must have been very sick when she wrote this. My dearest Caleb, if you're reading this, it means Eliza found you. It means you came looking for the locket, which means some part of you still remembers, still cares. I choose to believe that's true, even though I know I'm probably being foolish. I'm dying as I write this. Cholera, the doctor says, though he didn't need to tell me. I can feel it. The way it's hollowing me out, taking me piece by piece. I probably have days left. Maybe a week if I'm unlucky. I should be angry with you. I have every right to be. You took everything from me and left me with nothing. You broke promises that should have been sacred. You chose land and money over love, and that choice sent me down a path that led here, to this room, to this disease, to this end. But I'm not angry. I tried to be, for years, tried to hate you the way I should. But every time I looked at your picture, yes, I kept your picture too. How ridiculous is that? I remembered the man you were when we met. The man who talked about building something good. The man who promised to be different. And I wonder, what happened to him? What scared him so badly that he buried that version of himself and became what he swore he'd never be? Because I know you, Caleb. Or I knew you. And the man I knew wouldn't have foreclosed on my brother's debt for profit. He would have done it because he was terrified, because he saw something coming and he panicked and he made choices he thought would keep him safe. The drought you predicted did come. I heard about it. Heard how it killed ranches all over Texas. Heard how you survived when so many others didn't. So maybe you were right. Maybe you did what you had to do. But here's what I learned in the years since you sent me away. There's always a choice. Always. Even when it feels like there isn't. Even when every option seems terrible. You chose safety over love, security over promises, survival over soul. And I wonder, was it worth it? Are you happy in that big house with all that land? Do you sleep well at night? Do you feel like the man you wanted to be? I doubt it. Because if you did, you wouldn't still be carrying my picture. You wouldn't be checking for that locket every day like a man checking for a wound that won't heal. So here's what I want you to know, in whatever time you have left. You can't undo what you did. You can't bring back the people you hurt, can't restore the homes you took, can't rebuild the lives you destroyed. The past is done, but you can stop adding to the wreckage. You can look at what you've become and decide that this isn't how your story ends. You can choose differently from here forward. It won't erase what came before. It won't make you the man you promised to be. But it might make you someone who can look at himself in the mirror without flinching. I forgive you, Caleb, not because you deserve it, not because what you did was okay, but because holding on to anger takes energy I don't have anymore. And because somewhere, buried under all that armor you built, I still believe there's a piece of the man I loved. Prove me right, please. With love, even now, even still, Sarah. Caleb read the letter 3 times, and with each reading, something inside him broke apart a little more. By the 3rd time through, he was crying. Great, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere he didn't know existed. She'd forgiven him. Even after everything, even dying alone in a tenement 1,000 miles from home, she'd forgiven him. And he'd done nothing to deserve it. He sat under that oak tree and cried for Sarah Vance. Cried for the girl she'd been, and the woman she'd become, and the life she'd never gotten to live. Cried for the man he'd been when he'd met her, full of ideals and promises and certainty that he could do things differently. Cried for the 2 decades he'd spent building an empire on the graves of everyone who'd trusted him. When the tears finally stopped, he felt hollow, scooped out, like there was nothing left inside him but empty space and echoes. Eliza came back as the sun was starting to dip toward the horizon. She sat down without a word, waited. "She forgave me," Caleb said. His voice was hoarse. "She did. I don't deserve it." "No, you don't." Eliza's voice was gentle now, not accusing, just factual. "But she gave it to you anyway. That's who she was." Caleb looked at the locket in his hands. "What do I do now?" "That's up to you. I can't tell you how to live with this." "You spent 12 years planning this. You must have thought about what comes after." Eliza was quiet for a moment. "I thought you'd deny it. Thought you'd get angry, threaten me, maybe even hurt me. I thought I'd have to force you to see, to understand. And instead you broke. Right here, right where she loved you." Eliza looked up at the oak tree, its branches spreading above them. "I don't know if that's better or worse." Caleb stood up slowly. His whole body ached, but it was a different kind of pain than he'd felt before. Not physical, something deeper. "The grave. Can I see it?" They walked together across the field to the small rise. The grave was there, just as Eliza had said. A simple marker, hand-carved. Sarah Marie Vance. 1836 to 1866. Beloved sister. Caleb knelt beside it. The ground was hard, packed tight by years of weather. Wildflowers grew around it, not planted, just wild, claiming this space for themselves. I used to come here every year on her birthday, Eliza said. Tell her about my life, about what was happening in the world, about you. What did you tell her about me? The truth. That you were rich and powerful and empty. That you'd built exactly what you set out to build, and it had cost you everything that mattered. Caleb placed his hand on the marker. The stone was warm from the sun. I'm sorry, Sarah. I'm so sorry. The words felt inadequate, useless, but they were all he had. They stood there in silence as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. The creek kept flowing, indifferent to human grief. Finally, Eliza spoke. There's one more thing you need to see. She led him back to the old house. The front door hung open, half off its hinges. Inside, everything was dust and decay. But in what must have been the main room, there was a trunk, old but intact. I found this when I came back 7 years ago, Eliza said. Sarah's things. The things she couldn't take with her when you sent her away. She opened it. Inside were dresses, carefully folded. A wedding dress that had never been worn. Letters tied with ribbon. His letters, Caleb realized, the ones he'd written during their engagement. Books, a dried flower. 100 small pieces of a life that had been interrupted. And at the bottom, a ledger. Eliza pulled it out, handed it to him. She kept this for 3 years after she left. Her own accounting of what you took from her. Caleb opened it with hands that shook. The entries were precise, detailed. The home where I was born. Value cannot be calculated. My brother's grave. Value cannot be calculated. The oak tree where we were engaged. Value cannot be calculated. My future. Value cannot be calculated. My trust in love. Value cannot be calculated. My belief that people keep their promises. Value cannot be calculated. Page after page of things lost, things taken, things destroyed. And beside each one, the same notation, value cannot be calculated. She wrote this trying to make sense of it, Eliza said, trying to quantify what you'd done so she could understand it. But she couldn't. Because some things don't have a price. Some losses can't be measured in dollars. Caleb closed the ledger, carefully, like it might shatter. I've spent 20 years tracking every acquisition, every dollar, every acre. I thought if I could just accumulate enough, it would prove something, that I'd made the right choice, that it was worth it. And did it? No. He looked around at the ruined house, at the ghost of a life that could have been. It proved the opposite. They walked back outside. The stars were coming out now, brilliant in the clear Texas sky. Smoke was still tied to the fence post, dozing. What are you going to do? Eliza asked. Caleb looked back at the grave on the hill, barely visible now in the gathering dark. I don't know, but I can't go back. Can't go back to my ranch and my ledgers and pretend none of this happened. No, you can't. Eliza pulled out one more envelope. This is the deed to this land. You've held it for 22 years. I'm asking you to sign it over to me. Done. He didn't even hesitate. Just like that? It was never really mine anyway. He took the deed, pulled out a pen, signed it over to her on the spot. What will you do with it? I don't know yet. Maybe rebuild. Maybe just let it rest. She took the deed, folded it carefully. Thank you. They stood there in the darkness, two people bound together by a dead woman's love and a living man's wreckage. She really forgave me, Caleb said. It wasn't a question, just a statement of fact that still didn't feel real. She did. I don't know how to live with that. Neither do I, Eliza admitted. But I think that's the point. I think we have to figure it out anyway. Caleb untied Smoke but didn't mount. Where will you go? Back to town eventually. I have some money saved. I'll figure something out. She looked at him in the starlight. Where will you go? He thought about his ranch, sitting empty. Thought about his ledgers full of acquisitions and foreclosures. Thought about the empire he'd built on broken promises and calculated cruelty. Thought about Sarah's words. You can choose differently from here forward. I don't know, he said honestly, but not back. Not to who I was. That's a start. He mounted Smoke, sat there looking down at her. Thank you for making me see this, for... He stopped, couldn't find the words. Don't thank me yet, Eliza said. The hard part is just beginning. Seeing what you've done is one thing. Living with it is another. Caleb nodded. He turned Smoke west, back toward his ranch, back toward the life he'd built. But as he rode away from the Vance homestead, with Sarah's locket in his pocket and her letter against his heart, he knew Eliza was right. Everything was about to change. And for the first time in 22 years, he had no idea what came next. The ride back to his ranch took 3 days, but Caleb barely noticed the passage of time. His mind was somewhere else entirely, caught between the ghost of who he'd been and the monster he'd become. When he finally crested the last hill and saw his property spread out below, the sight hit him differently than it ever had before. The pristine fences, the ordered rows of cattle, the grand house sitting like a crown on top of it all. It looked like a painting, beautiful and lifeless and utterly false. He'd built a monument to his own fear. Caleb stabled Smoke and walked into his empty house. The silence that had bothered him before now felt appropriate, honest. This was what he'd actually created, a beautiful shell with nothing inside it. He went straight to his study, pulled out his master ledger, and opened it to the first page. The entries went back 23 years, starting with the 200 acres his father had left him. Every acquisition after that was documented in his careful handwriting. Every foreclosure, every purchase, every piece of land absorbed into his growing empire. He started counting, not acres, not dollars, lives. The Johnson settlement. 37 families displaced. The Hernandez farm. 3 generations scattered. The Blackwell Ranch. 1 suicide. The Vance property. 1 woman sent out into the world to die alone. By the time he reached the last entry, he'd counted 43 families. Hundreds of individual people whose lives had been upended, destroyed, or fundamentally altered by his pursuit of security. 43 families. And he couldn't remember most of their names. Caleb closed the ledger and sat back in his chair. The late afternoon sun slanted through the window, making the dust motes visible in the air. Everything was so quiet, so perfectly, horribly quiet. There was a knock at the door. For a moment, Caleb considered not answering, but the knock came again, insistent, and he found himself walking to the entrance almost against his will. Sheriff Dawson stood on his porch, hat in hand, looking uncomfortable. Caleb? Marcus? Caleb stepped aside. Come in. Dawson walked in slowly, looking around like he'd never seen the place before. Maybe he hadn't, Caleb realized. In all the years they'd known each other, he couldn't remember ever inviting the sheriff inside. Can I get you something? Coffee? Or... No, I'm fine. Dawson turned to face him. I heard you were back. Wanted to check on you. I'm alive. That's not what I meant. Dawson studied him. You look different. What happened out there? Caleb almost laughed. What hadn't happened? I found what I was looking for. The locket? Among other things. Caleb walked past him into the parlor, gestured for Dawson to follow. They sat in chairs that had probably cost more than most people made in a year, surrounded by expensive furniture that had never been used for anything but show. You want to tell me about it? Dawson asked. Not particularly. Fair enough. Dawson leaned back. Look, I came here for a reason. There's been talk about you being gone, about that housekeeper of yours, about what you've been doing. What kind of talk? The concerned kind. People wondering if you're planning something, if there's going to be, repercussions for the folks who wouldn't help you. Caleb felt something cold settle in his stomach. Of course. Of course they'd be worried about that. He'd spent 20 years teaching them to fear his retribution. Tell them they're safe, he said quietly. Tell them I'm not coming after anyone. Dawson raised an eyebrow. Just like that? Just like that. Forgive me for being suspicious, but that doesn't sound like the Caleb Thornridge I know. Maybe you don't know me as well as you thought. Caleb stood, walked to the window. Or maybe I don't know myself as well as I thought. Dawson was quiet for a moment. What happened out there, Caleb? I saw what I'd built, really saw it. He turned back to face the sheriff. And I didn't like what I found. So what are you going to do about it? That was the question, wasn't it? The question that had been circling in his head for 3 days, that had kept him awake at night, that had made him sick to his stomach every time he tried to answer it. "I don't know yet," Caleb admitted, "but I can't keep doing what I've been doing. I can't keep taking and calling it business." Dawson stood up slowly. "That's quite a realization. Is it enough?" "I don't know. Is it?" Caleb didn't have an answer to that. After Dawson left, Caleb went back to his study and pulled out a fresh piece of paper. He sat there for a long time, pen in hand, trying to figure out where to start. Finally, he began to write. The first letter was to Tom Hendricks, the man who'd refused to tell him where Eliza had gone. Short and direct. An apology for the implied threat, and a payment of $500 for his discretion and integrity. The second was to Margaret Sutton, whose mother's farm he'd foreclosed on 16 years ago. He didn't try to justify what he'd done, just acknowledged it, apologized, and included a bank draft for the difference between what he'd paid and what the property had actually been worth. The third letter was harder. It was to the widow of John Blackwell, the man who'd hanged himself in his barn after Caleb had driven him into bankruptcy. What could he possibly say to her? What amount of money could make up for a dead husband? He wrote it anyway, apologized anyway. Sent a bank draft that probably wouldn't help, but was all he had to offer. By midnight, he'd written 14 letters. His hand was cramping, his eyes were burning, and he'd barely made a dent in the list of people he'd wronged. But it was a start. Over the next week, Caleb did something he'd never done before. He went through his entire ledger, entry by entry, and tried to track down every person he'd displaced, every family he'd destroyed, every life he'd derailed. Some were dead. Some had moved on, gone so far that he couldn't find them. But for the ones he could locate, he wrote letters, sent money, offered what restitution he could. Most didn't respond. A few sent the money back with angry notes. One woman showed up at his door and threw her bank draft in his face. "You think money fixes this?" she'd screamed. "You think a few $1,000s makes up for what you took from us?" "No," Caleb had said quietly. "It doesn't. But it's all I have." She'd stared at him, tears streaming down her face. "My children grew up in poverty because of you. My husband drank himself to death because of you. And you think a check makes that right?" "I don't think anything makes it right. I'm just trying to—" He'd stopped, unable to finish. Trying to what? Sleep at night? Feel better about yourself? She'd shaken her head. "Keep your money. I don't want anything from you." She'd left, and Caleb had stood on his porch feeling the weight of it settle deeper. She was right. Money didn't fix anything. Couldn't fix anything. But what else did he have? 2 weeks after returning from the Vance homestead, Caleb received a visitor he wasn't expecting. James Morrison was a banker from Dallas, a man Caleb had done business with for years. He arrived in an expensive carriage, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than most families made in 6 months, carrying a leather case full of documents. "Caleb!" He strode up with his hand extended, all smiles. "Good to see you. Been trying to reach you for weeks." Caleb shook his hand without enthusiasm. "James? What brings you out here? Opportunity, my friend? Major opportunity?" Morrison followed him inside, already talking. "You've heard about the railroad expansion, I assume? They're planning a new route through the territory, and I've got inside information on exactly where the stations are going to be." He spread maps on Caleb's desk, pointing to marked locations. "Look here, and here. Prime land currently owned by small ranchers who don't know what's coming. If we move fast, we can buy up these properties for next to nothing and resell to the railroad for 10 times what we paid." Caleb looked at the maps, saw the marked properties, saw the names of the current owners scribbled in the margins. The old Caleb would have jumped at this, would have already been calculating profit margins and planning his approach. "No," he said. Morrison looked up, confused. "No what?" "No to all of it. I'm not interested." "Not interested? Caleb, are you feeling all right? This is the kind of deal we've been waiting for. Clean, legal, massive profit potential." "Legal doesn't mean right." Morrison laughed. "Since when do you care about right? You've made a fortune on deals exactly like this." "I know. That's the problem." The banker's smile faded. "I don't understand. These families," Caleb pointed at the names on the map, "they don't know what's coming. They don't know their land is about to be worth a fortune, and you want us to take advantage of that information, buy them out cheap, and make a killing. That's business, Caleb. That's how it works." No. Caleb gathered up the maps and handed them back. That's theft. We just use contracts instead of guns. Morrison stared at him like he'd grown a second head. What happened to you? I woke up. Caleb walked to the door, opened it. And I'm not doing this anymore. Not with you, not with anyone. You're serious? Completely. Morrison gathered his papers slowly, shaking his head. This is a mistake, Caleb. A huge mistake. This territory doesn't reward weakness. Maybe, but it doesn't reward what I've been doing either. Not in any way that matters. After Morrison left, Caleb sat alone in his study and thought about the railroad deal. Thought about all the deals like it he'd done over the years. All the times he'd used information as a weapon. Had exploited people's ignorance for profit. He pulled out the maps Morrison had left behind. The banker had been so flustered he'd forgotten them. And looked at the names. 7 families. 7 properties right in the path of progress, about to be offered pennies for land worth a fortune. Caleb made a decision. It took him 3 days to track down all 7 families. He rode out to each property personally, maps in hand, and told them the truth. The railroad's coming through, he'd say, right through your land. In 6 months, maybe a year, they're going to make you an offer. Don't take the first one. Don't take the second one. Hold out for what it's really worth. Some believed him. Some thought it was a trick. All were suspicious. Why are you telling us this? A rancher named Patterson had asked. What's in it for you? Nothing. There's nothing in it for me. Then why? Caleb had looked around at the man's property. A modest ranch, well kept, clearly loved. Because someone should have told me once that there are things more valuable than money, and I didn't listen. Maybe you will. He'd left before Patterson could respond. By the end of the 3rd day, Caleb had warned all 7 families. He'd also made himself some new enemies. Morrison had heard what he was doing and was furious. So were the other investors who'd been planning to cash in on the railroad route. But Caleb found he didn't care. For the first time in decades, he'd done something that didn't turn his stomach. It wasn't enough. Not nearly enough to balance the scales, but it was different. A month after his return, Caleb was sitting on his porch at sunset when another visitor arrived. Eliza Vance rode up on a mule, looking tired and dusty but determined. She dismounted, tied the mule, and climbed the porch steps. Eliza! Mr. Thornridge. She sat down in the chair next to his without being invited. I heard you've been busy. Word travels. It does, especially when Caleb Thornridge starts giving money away instead of taking it. People notice. Caleb didn't respond, just watched the sun sink lower. I also heard you killed a major railroad deal, Eliza continued. Cost yourself and several investors a fortune. The investors will survive. And you? I'll survive too, just with less money. Eliza was quiet for a moment. Why are you doing this? You know why. Do I? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're trying to buy forgiveness. Trying to pay your way back to feeling human. Caleb flinched. Maybe I am. Is that wrong? It's not enough. Eliza turned to face him. Money is easy for you, Caleb. Writing checks doesn't cost you anything that matters. If you really want to change, you have to give up something that hurts. Like what? She gestured around at the ranch, the land, the empire he'd built. This. All of it. This monument to your fear. You want me to give up my ranch? I want you to stop hiding behind it. Stop using wealth as armor. Eliza stood up. Sarah forgave you, but she also challenged you. She told you to choose differently. Writing checks isn't choosing differently. It's just redistributing the spoils. She walked down the porch steps, then turned back. There's a town meeting next week. In Redemption. The small ranchers are organizing, trying to figure out how to compete with men like you. Men who have all the advantages, all the resources, all the power. What does that have to do with me? You could help them. Not with money. With knowledge. With the advantages you've had all these years. She untied her mule. Or you could stay here on your porch, feeling sorry for yourself and writing checks to ease your conscience. Your choice. She rode away, leaving Caleb alone with the sunset and his thoughts. The town meeting was held in the community hall, a simple wooden building that had seen better days. Caleb arrived early, before the crowd, and stood outside trying to work up the courage to go in. Through the windows, he could see people gathering, ranchers he recognized, families he'd competed against, outmaneuvered, occasionally crushed. They were setting up chairs, organizing papers, preparing to discuss strategies for survival in a territory that wasn't kind to the small or weak. A hand touched his shoulder. He turned to find Sheriff Dawson standing there. "You actually came," Dawson said. "I'm thinking about it." "That's more than I expected." Dawson nodded toward the building. "Fair warning, you're not going to be popular in there." "I know. Some of these folks have good reason to hate you." "I know that too." Dawson studied him. "So why are you here?" "Because someone told me that writing checks isn't enough, that if I really want to change, I have to give up something that hurts." Caleb looked at the gathering inside. "My knowledge, my advantages, the things that let me win for 20 years while everyone else struggled." "You're going to help them compete against you?" "I'm going to help them compete, period. Whether it's against me or someone else like me." Dawson let out a low whistle. "That's either the bravest thing I've ever heard or the stupidest." "Probably both." They walked in together. The room went quiet the instant people saw Caleb. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. People stared, some with open hostility, others with confusion. An older rancher named Jeremiah Stone stood up. "What's he doing here?" "I invited him," Eliza said, emerging from the back of the room. "Everyone sit down." "You invited Caleb Thornridge to a meeting about how to survive against men like Caleb Thornridge?" Stone looked incredulous. "Have you lost your mind?" "Possibly. Sit down anyway." Slowly, reluctantly, people took their seats. Caleb stood at the front of the room, acutely aware of every hostile glare, every whispered comment. "I know most of you hate me," he started. "I know I've spent 20 years making your lives harder, taking your land, undercutting your prices, using every advantage I had to crush competition." "Then why are you here?" someone called out. "Because I'm done doing that. And because I know things that could help you. Things about how banks work, how to negotiate with railroads, how to form cooperatives that actually have power." He paused. "Things I used against you for years. I want to teach you those things instead." The room erupted. Half the people were shouting questions. The other half were shouting objections. Stone stood up again, his face red. "This is a trick. He's here to find out our strategies, our plans, so he can counter them." "I'm not," Caleb said, but his voice was lost in the noise. Eliza stood up, and somehow her quiet presence cut through the chaos better than shouting would have. "Listen to him. Just listen. If you don't like what he has to say, you can throw him out. But give him a chance." The room settled down, though the hostility remained thick in the air. Caleb took a breath. "The railroad is coming. You all know that. And when it does, men like Morrison, men like the old me, are going to try to buy your land cheap and resell it for a fortune. I've already warned some of you about this, but there's more you need to know." He spent the next hour laying it all out. The tactics he'd used, the legal loopholes, the ways banks and large landowners manipulated markets, the strategies for consolidation, for undercutting competitors, for using information as a weapon. And then he explained how to counter all of it, how to form a land trust that couldn't be broken up piecemeal, how to negotiate collectively for better prices, how to create cooperative agreements that gave small ranchers the same advantages large ones had. The room stayed quiet, listening despite themselves. Some took notes. Others just stared, trying to figure out if this was real or some elaborate con. When he finished, there was a long silence. Finally, a woman in the back stood up. Caleb recognized her. Mary Sutton, whose mother's farm he'd foreclosed on. The same woman who'd challenged him at her well. "Why should we trust you?" she asked. "Why should we believe this isn't just another way to manipulate us?" "You shouldn't," Caleb said honestly. "You should verify everything I've told you. Check with other sources, talk to lawyers, make sure I'm not lying. Don't take my word for anything." "Then what's the point?" "The point is that I'm giving you information you didn't have before. What you do with it is up to you." Another man stood up. "What do you get out of this?" "Nothing. I get nothing." "Everyone gets something. What's your angle?" Caleb looked around the room at all the faces staring back at him. Some hostile, some confused, all suspicious. "I spent 20 years building an empire," he said quietly, "and it cost me everything that mattered. I'm trying to figure out how to live with that, how to make the rest of my life mean something other than accumulated damage." He met Mary Sutton's eyes. "This doesn't fix what I did. Nothing can fix that. But maybe it can stop me from doing more harm. Maybe it can help make sure the next generation doesn't have to deal with another man like me. The meeting continued for another 2 hours. People asked questions, challenged his information, debated strategies. Caleb answered everything as honestly as he could, holding nothing back. When it finally ended, most people filed out without acknowledging him. A few shook his hand, wary but willing to see where this went. Mary Sutton was one of the last to leave. She stopped in front of him. "My mother died 5 years ago, heartbroken and poor because of what you did to us." "I know. I'm sorry." Sorry doesn't bring her back. She looked at him for a long moment. "But if you're serious about this, about really changing, then prove it. Keep coming to these meetings. Keep sharing what you know. And when you're tempted to go back to your old ways, remember that we're watching." She walked out, leaving Caleb standing in the empty hall with Eliza and Sheriff Dawson. "Well," Dawson said, "that was something." "That was a start," Eliza corrected. She walked over to Caleb. "You did good tonight, but she's right. You have to keep doing it. One meeting doesn't change 20 years of damage." "I know." "Do you? Because it's going to be hard. Every time you help them, you're giving up advantages, making yourself weaker, making it easier for them to compete with you." "Good." Eliza smiled, a small, sad expression. "Sarah would be proud of you, for tonight at least." Caleb felt something crack in his chest. "You think so?" "I do. But the real question is whether you'll be proud of yourself, whether you can keep choosing the hard thing instead of the easy thing." After they left, Caleb stood alone in the empty hall and thought about that, about choosing the hard thing, about giving up power instead of accumulating it, about becoming the man Sarah had believed he could be instead of the man fear had made him. It felt impossible, like trying to unwind 20 years of bad decisions with a few good ones. But as he walked out into the night, he realized something. It didn't matter if it was impossible. It didn't matter if he could never balance the scales, never make up for what he'd done. What mattered was that he try anyway. What mattered was that he stop adding to the wreckage and start building something different, even if it killed him, even if it cost him everything he had left. Even if he failed, he had to try. 3 months passed, and Caleb learned what it meant to give things away. He kept attending the meetings, kept sharing strategies, contacts, information that had once been his competitive edge, watched as the small ranchers grew stronger, more organized, more capable of standing up to the larger landowners who'd been bleeding them dry for years. And he watched his own power diminish with each piece of knowledge he handed over. Morrison stopped speaking to him entirely. Other business associates followed suit. Men who'd courted his favor for decades now crossed the street to avoid him. The bank in Dallas, which had always extended him unlimited credit, suddenly wanted guarantees. Collateral. Proof that he was still the Caleb Thornridge they'd known. He wasn't, and they could sense it. One evening in late October, Caleb was reviewing his accounts when he realized something that should have terrified him. His liquid assets had dropped by 40%. The loans he'd forgiven, the land he'd returned, the restitution payments he'd made, they'd bled him nearly dry. He sat back in his chair and waited for the panic to hit. The old Caleb would have been calculating recovery strategies, planning new acquisitions, figuring out how to rebuild what he'd lost. Instead, he felt something close to relief, like he'd been carrying a weight for so long he'd forgotten it was there, and someone had finally lifted it off his shoulders. The knock came just after sunset. Caleb opened the door to find Eliza standing there, her face pale, her hands shaking. "What's wrong?" "It's the weather. The river." She pushed past him into the house. "There's a storm coming, a big one. Jeremiah Stone's son works for the weather service in Dallas. He sent word. Heavy rains upstream for the past week. The creek's already rising, and the worst hasn't hit yet." Caleb's stomach dropped. The creek that ran through this territory wasn't much most of the year. Shallow, meandering, easily crossable. But when it flooded, it became something else entirely. He'd seen it happen once, back when he was young. Whole homesteads washed away, livestock drowned, people trapped. How bad are they predicting? Worst in 30 years. Maybe worse than that. Eliza gripped the back of a chair. The small ranchers, the ones down in the low country, they're right in the path, and most of them don't have the resources to evacuate, don't have anywhere to go. Caleb thought about the families he'd been helping these past months, thought about their small ranches, Their modest homes built in the fertile bottomland near the creek because that's where they could afford to be. How long do we have? 24 hours, maybe less if the rain hits harder than expected. Caleb was already moving, his mind shifting into the mode that had made him successful for 20 years, calculating, planning, organizing. But this time, the calculation wasn't about profit. It was about lives. We need wagons, as many as we can get, and people with teams who know the territory. He grabbed paper and started writing. The Morrison place has high ground. So does the Patterson Ranch. We need to convince them to open their land to refugees. Morrison hates you now. You cost him a fortune on that railroad deal. I know, but he's also not stupid. If the flood's as bad as you're saying, having goodwill with his neighbors might matter more than money. Caleb kept writing. What about supplies, food, blankets, medical provisions? The town has some emergency stores, but not enough for this many people. I have warehouses, full of supplies I've been hoarding for winter. He looked up. We can use those. Eliza stared at him. Those supplies are worth thousands of dollars. And they're worthless if everyone's dead. He handed her the list. Can you get this to Sheriff Dawson? We need to start organizing now. She took the paper but didn't move. You're really going to do this? Give away your winter stores, convince your enemies to help, risk your own property to save people who hate you? Yes. Why? Caleb thought about Sarah's letter, about her challenge to choose differently, thought about the past 3 months, about learning to give instead of take, thought about the man he'd been trying to become instead of the man he'd been. Because it's the right thing to do, and because for once in my life, I want to do something that doesn't require me to calculate the profit margin first. Within 2 hours, Caleb's ranch had transformed into a command center. Sheriff Dawson arrived with deputies. Jeremiah Stone and other ranchers showed up, initially suspicious but willing to listen. Even Morrison came, drawn by Dawson's urgent message, though he refused to look at Caleb directly. Caleb spread maps across his dining table, marking the low-lying properties, the safe high ground, the routes between them. The Hendricks place is here, he pointed. 23 people, counting children. The creek loops around their property on 2 sides. When it floods, they'll be completely cut off. They'll never make it out in time, Stone said. Not with that many kids. They will if we go get them. Caleb marked the route. There's a ridge here that should stay above water. If we take wagons out tonight, we can evacuate them before the worst hits. Morrison finally spoke. And who's going to risk their necks doing that? Who's going to drive wagons in the dark through a rising flood? I will. Caleb met his eyes. I'll lead the first team. You? Morrison laughed, but there was no humor in it. When's the last time you did manual labor, Caleb? When's the last time you risked anything more than money? 3 months ago, I would have deserved that. Today? Caleb stood up. Today I'm asking you to put aside whatever you think about me and help save lives. You can hate me tomorrow. But tonight, we have work to do. The room went quiet. Then Stone cleared his throat. The Patterson place can house maybe 50 people. We'll need to coordinate who goes where. Morrison stared at Caleb for a long moment, then looked down at the map. The high ground on my property can handle 100, maybe more if people don't mind being crowded. One by one, the other ranchers started contributing, offering wagons, teams of horses, supplies, space. The plan came together piece by piece, a cooperative effort that would have been impossible 3 months ago. By midnight, the first rescue teams were heading out. Caleb led one group, driving a wagon through darkness lit only by lanterns, feeling his way along paths he'd ridden 1,000 times, but never under conditions like this. The rain started before they reached the Hendricks place. Not a gentle rain, but a wall of water that turned the world into a blurred nightmare. The wagon wheels slipped in mud that hadn't existed an hour before. The creek, normally a peaceful background noise, roared like something alive and angry. They reached the Hendricks farm to find Tom Hendricks and his family frantically loading what they could into a small cart. "Leave it!" Caleb shouted over the rain. "Leave everything except people and get in the wagon." "I can't just leave." "You can and you will." Caleb jumped down, started helping children into the wagon. "Your life is worth more than things. Move." Tom stared at him, recognition dawning even in the darkness and rain. "Thorn Ridge. We can talk about it later. Right now, get your family in the wagon." They loaded everyone. Tom, his wife, their 5 children, an elderly mother who couldn't walk, a hired hand who'd been helping with the evacuation. The wagon was packed, people pressed together, children crying, everyone soaked and scared. The drive back was worse than the drive out. The rain intensified. The creek had risen visibly, even in the hour they'd been gone. Caleb could hear trees cracking, falling somewhere in the darkness. The horses were panicking, and it took everything he had to keep them moving forward. Halfway back, they hit water across the road. Not deep yet, but moving fast. Caleb stopped the wagon, trying to gauge if they could make it through. "We have to go around," Tom shouted from the back. "There is no around. This is the only way to high ground." "Then we're trapped." Caleb looked at the water, looked at the terrified faces behind him, and made a decision. He climbed down from the wagon, took the lead horse's bridle. "What are you doing?" Tom yelled. "Walking them through. The horses can feel the bottom better than I can see it." He started forward into the current, feeling the water rise to his knees, then his thighs. The current was stronger than he'd expected. It pulled at him, trying to knock him off his feet. The horse was fighting him, terrified, and Caleb had to use all his strength to keep moving forward. Step by step, he walked them through. The water peaked at his chest, cold enough to steal his breath, strong enough that he was sure for a moment he was going to lose his footing and be swept away. But he made it. They made it. The wagon rolled up onto dry ground on the other side, and Caleb collapsed on the bank, coughing up creek water and shaking from cold and adrenaline. Tom climbed down, helped him up. "You could have drowned." "So could you. So could your family." Caleb climbed back onto the wagon seat. "Let's get you somewhere safe." They reached Morrison's property 2 hours later. The house was blazing with light, people moving in organized chaos, setting up sleeping areas and distributing blankets. Morrison himself was directing traffic, and his face when he saw Caleb was complicated. "You look like hell," Morrison said. "Feel like it too." Caleb helped the Hendricks family down. "Got room for 8 more?" "We'll make room." Morrison watched the children run inside, seeking warmth. "The other teams are reporting in. Looks like we're getting most people out." "Most isn't all." "No, there's a family out near Devil's Bend that we can't reach, the Cartwrights. Water's already cut off the roads." Caleb knew the Cartwrights. A young couple with 3 small children trying to make it on land that had been in the wife's family for generations. Land that was now surrounded by rising water. "How many people do they have?" 5 total. "But Caleb, there's no way to get to them now. We'd have to, I'll go." Morrison grabbed his arm. "Did you not hear me? There's no road. The water's too high. You'll die trying." "Maybe, but I have to try." Caleb pulled free. "I spent 20 years putting people in impossible situations and telling myself it wasn't my problem. I'm not doing that anymore." He found Eliza inside, helping organize supplies. She took one look at his face and knew. "Don't," she said. "Whatever you're thinking, don't. The Cartwrights are trapped." "I know, I heard, but going after them now is suicide." "Probably." He grabbed a fresh lantern. "Tell Dawson where I've gone. If I'm not back by dawn." "If you're not back by dawn, you're dead." Eliza's eyes were fierce. "And Sarah's forgiveness won't mean anything because you'll have thrown your life away on a grand gesture." "It's not a gesture. It's 5 people who'll die if someone doesn't help them. And you'll die helping them." "Maybe. But at least I'll die doing something that matters." He headed for the door, then turned back. "Thank you, Eliza. For everything. For showing me what I'd become. For giving me a chance to be different." He was gone before she could respond. The ride to Devil's Bend was a nightmare. The roads were gone, washed away or submerged. Caleb had to navigate by memory and instinct, following high ground where he could find it, sometimes dismounting and leading smoke through water that was already too deep. The rain never stopped. Thunder cracked overhead, lightning illuminating a landscape transformed into something alien and hostile. Twice, Caleb thought he'd lost the way entirely. Once, smoke slipped in the mud and nearly threw him, but he kept going. Because 5 people were trapped. Because he'd spent 20 years making situations like this worse. Because Sarah had challenged him to be better, and this was the only way he knew how. He found the Cartwright place just before dawn. The house was an island surrounded by water that was still rising. Peter Cartwright was on the roof with his wife and children trying to stay above the flood. "Thornridge?" Peter shouted in disbelief. "What are you doing here?" "Getting you out!" Caleb urged Smoke into the water, deeper than he'd gone before. The horse was swimming now, powerful legs churning against the current. They reached the house. The water was up to the eaves. Another few hours and it would be over the roof. "We need to move fast," Caleb said. "Get the children ready." "There's no way," Peter's wife, Anna, said. Her voice was high with panic. "We can't swim in this. The children can't." "You're not going to swim. You're going to ride." Caleb looked around, thinking fast. "Do you have rope?" They did. Working quickly, Caleb rigged a makeshift harness system. The smallest children would ride in front, held secure by rope. The older ones would ride behind. Anna and Peter would walk alongside, using the horse for stability. It was insane. Dangerous. Probably impossible. They did it anyway. The journey back was the longest of Caleb's life. Every step was a battle against the current. The children were crying, terrified. Anna slipped twice, and only the rope kept her from being swept away. Peter was struggling, exhausted from a night on the roof, but they kept moving. Step by impossible step, they made progress. The sun was rising when they finally reached high ground. People came running: Stone, Dawson, Morrison, Eliza. They pulled the Cartwrights to safety, wrapped them in blankets, carried the exhausted children inside. Caleb slid off Smoke and sat down in the mud, too tired to stand. Eliza knelt beside him. "You idiot," she said, but she was crying. "You magnificent, stupid idiot." "Are they okay?" "They're fine. You saved them." She helped him to his feet. "Come on, let's get you inside." The flood lasted 3 days. In that time, Caleb's ranch became a refuge for over 200 people. His warehouses were emptied, feeding them. His house, which had been a monument to his isolation, became a community space filled with voices and children and life. He worked alongside everyone else, distributing supplies, helping with cooking, coordinating rescue efforts. When someone recognized him and started to object to his presence, others would step in. "He saved my family," Tom Hendricks said. "Nearly drowned doing it. I don't care what he did before. Right now, he's here helping." Slowly, grudgingly, people accepted him. Not as the powerful rancher who'd crushed their neighbors, as just another pair of hands doing what needed to be done. On the 4th day, the rain stopped. The water began to recede. People started venturing back to their properties to assess the damage. It was worse than anyone had feared. Entire farms had been washed away, livestock drowned, crops destroyed. Families who'd been barely surviving before were now looking at total ruin. Caleb stood on his porch, looking out at the transformed landscape, and made a decision. That evening, he called a meeting. Everyone who'd taken refuge on his property gathered in his barn. The house was too small for the crowd. "I know most of you are facing disaster," Caleb started. "I know you're wondering how you're going to rebuild, how you're going to survive." "We'll manage," Stone said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You will, but you don't have to do it alone." Caleb took a breath. "I'm dissolving my land holdings, breaking up my empire. The land that I legally own but morally stole, I'm giving it back. Not selling it. Giving it." The barn went silent. "Those of you whose families I displaced, whose property I foreclosed on, if you want it back, it's yours. Free and clear. I'll have the deeds drawn up and transferred." "Why?" Morrison asked. "What's the catch?" "No catch. I'm just done. Done building empires, done accumulating power, done measuring success by how much I can take from others." He looked around at all the faces staring at him in disbelief. "For those of you who've lost everything in the flood, there's land available now. Good land. I'm offering it to anyone who needs it. We can form a cooperative, work it together, share the profits." "A cooperative?" Peter Cartwright stood up. "You mean like the one you've been teaching us about?" "Exactly like that. A community instead of a kingdom. Shared resources instead of hoarded wealth." Caleb felt the weight lifting with every word. "I'll contribute what I have left, equipment, remaining supplies, knowledge, but the land belongs to everyone. The decisions belong to everyone. I'm done being in charge." "And what do you get?" someone called out. "A chance to build something that doesn't turn my stomach. A chance to be part of something instead of standing above it." He paused. "And maybe, if I work at it long enough, a chance to sleep at night without seeing the faces of everyone I've hurt." The discussion went on for hours. People were skeptical, suspicious, waiting for the trap. But slowly, As Caleb answered every question, addressed every concern, showed them the deeds he was prepared to transfer, they began to believe. Not everyone accepted. Some people's hatred ran too deep, their wounds too raw. They took their families and left, and Caleb didn't blame them. But others stayed. Others were willing to try. Over the next 6 months, Caleb's empire was systematically dismantled. The land was redistributed. The cooperative was formed. A governing council was elected. Stone, Hendricks, the Cartwrights, Mary Sutton, and 4 others. Caleb had a vote, but only one. Same as everyone else. His mansion was converted into a community center. His warehouses became shared storage. His wealth, which had once seemed infinite, was poured into rebuilding what the flood had destroyed. By spring, Caleb Thornridge was no longer the richest man in the territory. He wasn't the most powerful. He wasn't feared or envied or courted by bankers and politicians. He was just a man, a member of a community, one voice among many, and for the first time in 22 years, he could breathe. One evening, in April, exactly a year after Eliza had disappeared with the locket, Caleb found himself back at the Vance homestead. He'd been coming here regularly, helping Eliza rebuild. The house had a new roof now. The barn was being reconstructed. The fields were planted with crops that would belong to the cooperative. They sat together under the oak tree as the sun set, tired from a day of work. "You've changed," Eliza said quietly. "Have I? Or did I just finally become who I should have been all along? Does it matter? Change is change." Caleb pulled out the locket, which he still carried, not in his vest pocket anymore, just in his hand sometimes when he needed to remember. "I still miss her," he said. "Still wish I could tell her I'm sorry. Tell her I'm trying." "She knows." Eliza put her hand over his. "Wherever she is, she knows." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sky turn colors. "The cooperative is voting next week on whether to expand," Eliza said. "There are 3 more families who want to join, good people who lost everything." "What do you think?" "I think we have room. I think that's the whole point. There's always room if we're willing to share." She looked at him. "What do you think?" "I think my vote is one of 12. I think I'll listen to what everyone has to say and vote my conscience." He smiled. "I think that's all I can do." "And you're okay with that? With not being in control?" Caleb thought about his old ranch, about the empire he'd built, about the power he'd accumulated and the isolation it had brought. Thought about the past year, about working alongside people instead of above them, about building instead of taking. "More than okay," he said. "I spent 20 years controlling everything and ended up with nothing that mattered. Now I control almost nothing, and I have—" He gestured around at the rebuilt homestead, at the community they were creating. This is enough? This is more than I deserve, and exactly what I need." As full dark fell, they walked back toward the house where a community dinner was being organized. People were arriving, bringing food, setting up tables. Children were running around, playing. Someone had brought a fiddle. Caleb stood at the edge of it all, watching. Once, this would have made him uncomfortable. All these people, all this chaos, all this lack of control. Now it felt like home. Mary Sutton's daughter ran up to him, grabbed his hand. "Mr. Caleb, come help us. We need someone tall to hang the lanterns." He let himself be pulled into the crowd, into the noise and mess, and beautiful chaos of people living together, struggling together, building something together. Later that night, after the dinner, after the music, after everyone had gone home or bedded down in the various houses, Caleb stood alone under the oak tree one more time. He opened the locket, looked at Sarah's face in the moonlight. "I hope this is what you meant," he said quietly. "I hope this is choosing differently." The night breeze moved through the branches above him, and somewhere in the distance the creek flowed peacefully, back to its normal size, life returning to the banks that had been scoured by flood. Caleb closed the locket and put it in his pocket. Not to check compulsively, not to guard obsessively, just to carry, the way you carry a reminder of who you were and who you're trying to be. He walked back to the small cabin he'd built for himself on the edge of the property. Simple, modest, everything he needed and nothing he didn't. For the first time in decades, he fell asleep quickly, without checking ledgers, without calculating profits, without planning tomorrow's conquests. He slept the sleep of a man who'd finally put down a burden he'd been carrying too long. And if he dreamed of Sarah, not as she'd been in death, but as she'd been under this tree all those years ago, young and hopeful and believing in his promises. And maybe, just maybe, proud of what those promises had finally become. The end came not with thunder but with quiet, not with grand gestures but with small daily choices to be better than he'd been. Not with redemption earned, but with forgiveness accepted and a life lived differently from that moment forward. Caleb Thornridge never became the man he'd promised to be at 24. That version was gone, lost somewhere in the wreckage of choices made in fear. But he became something else, something harder won and more honest. A man who'd seen what he was capable of becoming and chosen to become something different. A man who'd hurt people and couldn't undo that hurt, but could stop adding to it. A man who'd built an empire and then tore it down because the empire was killing him. Some people never forgave him. They were right not to. Some wounds don't heal just because the person who caused them says sorry, but others gave him a chance. Let him work alongside them. Let him prove through actions, not words, that change was possible. And slowly, year by year, the community grew. Not into an empire, into something messier and more beautiful. A place where power was shared, where decisions were made together, where no one person controlled everything and everyone mattered. Where 40 acres by a creek could be a home instead of an acquisition. Where a locket carried in a pocket meant memory instead of regret. Where a man could look at himself in the mirror and not flinch away from what he saw. It wasn't redemption. It was something smaller and more realistic. It was just living differently, choosing differently, building differently. It was enough.